Hello, my name's Lesley Atherton, and this is a small story called Parable of the Too Small House. But I don't want to move. I like it here. No, you don't. I do. I always have. But it's damp, George. The central heating's dodgy and the whole area's going downhill. But Claire, I like it here. What about all our neighbours and friends? Neighbours and friends? I don't think Doris from the corner shop is much of a friend. She calls you a fool behind your back. And she shortchanges you when you buy your cigarettes. I wouldn't mind, but she's one of the few who actually like you. What about her husband, Jerry? He likes me. Whatever you say, George, we need to move. This place is cramped and uncomfortable, even for the two of us. Yes, Claire, said George as he plumped himself down on his usual armchair, picked up his tobacco tin and began to roll a cigarette. Claire perched on the edge of his armchair. George, it's just that there's not enough room here for us and for our new resident. What? You haven't gone and got in a lodger? Oh, Claire, I told you not to. He lit his match with a little more aggression than was strictly necessary and inhaled on his newly lit cigarette as if it were an action specially designed to punish her. It's not that, George. It's just that we'll soon be hearing the sound of tiny little feet. A new dog? But Chestnut died a long time ago and we said we wouldn't get a baby, George. We're having a baby. Ah, said George, and the house isn't big enough. Well, we can't afford a baby and we can't afford a bigger house. It was fair to say that Claire had not expected a joyful reaction from her glass-half-empty husband. It was also fair to say that she didn't expect him to agree to her request to move to a new house. But she knew that it was the only solution. They'd have to move before the baby needed its own room, as a one-bedroom flat was no kind of a home for a growing family. George dragged deeply on his roll-up. Well, I don't want to move, and that's that. Claire knew he'd had his last say on the matter. She stopped stroking his shoulder in the hope that he'd respond, and moved back to her own orange armchair. Well, that was it. She would have to do what her mother always did. She'd go to Hazel, the village wise woman. Living as she did just a few streets away, Hazel had been regularly visited by many of Claire's family. Claire's mum had been to see her about such diverse subjects as how to keep the front step clean and white without working, how to get mice out of the kitchen, and how to make her husband fall in love with her. Hazel had been the village's wise woman for as long as anyone could remember. The rumour was that she was older than time. The following day, Claire arrived at Hazel's house. It didn't take long for her situation to be explained and for her to return home with a cat. Hold on a minute, moaned George. Are you trying to get me used to cleaning up shit? I told you, I don't want a baby, don't want a cat either. Neither did Claire at that moment. She was struggling to eat, struggling to sleep, and couldn't go anywhere near her mum's log burner as the smell made her heave immediately. Believe me, said Claire, there must be some logic behind this. I went to the wise woman for advice and she told me to get a cat. It will make sense soon, I'm sure. Wise woman, for God's sake. It continued. First, Claire bought a cat. The next day, a small dog. When she brought a goat into the living room the day after, George went absolutely crazy. There was more than a bit of swearing from him and more than a bit of cold sweating and vomiting from Claire. The noises, chaos and miscellaneous aromas emanating from these three new animals were enough to ensure Claire stayed in bed. The following day, Claire sent George on a mission. He brought home a cow, and to Claire's utter astonishment, George put the poor creature into their tiny backyard. This is animal cruelty, complained Claire. Human cruelty too, George agreed. There was more swearing. George was a very unhappy man. But there was no way that anyone ever disobeyed the wise woman. Nobody ever had since the 1950s, when a young mother refused to accept her advice and was found naked and dead within the hour. I'm going to see this mad woman again, George said, and he returned home that evening with a bale of hay and a horse. Claire, pale green in colour and floppy in consistency, was in bed. "I wish you'd never gone to see that blasted woman in the first place," George moaned. "Me too," thought Claire, as she pretended to be asleep. The following morning, after a single bout of vomiting, she was well enough to leave the house and make her way to Hazel's. She returned home and, as ordered by the wise woman, removed the horse and its hay from the house. The next day George returned the cow. Next to go were the goat and the dog and the cat. 11 days after Claire had first been to see the wise woman, things were just as they'd been before, apart from the manure-stained and wrecked carpets, the squashed and eaten furniture and the ripped curtains. George wasn't stupid. He understood why the wise woman had advised what she had. He also knew that the fabled intention ran like this: 1. House feels too small. 2. House gets overfilled. 3. House gets emptied. And 4. Couple realised that house was big enough all along. That's why they had both put up with everything the wise woman demanded. Partly because they were scared to go against Hazel's orders, and partly because they knew the animals wouldn't be staying for long. Even so, George couldn't live in the squalor and refused to replaster, decorate or purchase any new furniture. Within a week of the removal of the final animal, the decision was made by him to sell up. He just didn't love the place anymore. That wise woman's not so wise after all. Her silly scheme backfired. By the time Claire was 6 months pregnant, they had moved to a bigger house in a better area, and Claire was busy preparing the house for their new arrival. George loved the extra space, the shed, the garden, and the wonderfully large kitchen. There was, however, a secret that Claire had never told George, and never would. It was something that only the wise woman's customers knew. Her suggestion to bring the animals into the house was, like all her other suggestions, made for only one reason. And that reason was nothing to do with appreciating what you already had, no matter what George may have thought. It was all about getting the customer exactly what they wanted. And Claire, the customer who'd paid her money to Hazel in very, very good faith, had really, really wanted a new house.